Actually, Victoria is working as Director of Research, Development and Outreach and Taylor & Francis, which is one of the major publisher of the scientific journal, well, scientific papers. And her position is related to basically increasing the quality of papers that we, as an authors, produce. And I'm really, really happy to be able to listen to the talk, which will be more aimed toward the less experienced researchers. Victoria, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Jan.
Sorry, two more things. So I ask all of the participants to mute the microphone just to avoid the interferences. If you will have any questions, there is a button called Raise Your Hand, and I will interrupt Victoria if there will be questions during the talk and ask you to ask the question. If there will be no question during the talk, there will be a question and answer session afterwards. And yeah, that's it. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Jan. And thanks everyone for joining today. As said, this is going to be a talk that's geared towards what we call early career researchers. So those of you that have little to no experience in publishing in academic journals. And what I'm going to do is try and provide a broad overview of the process and some of the things for you to think about to ensure that you are successful through that process. And during the talk today, I'm going to turn my camera off just so that there's no problems with internet, but then I'll turn it back on when it comes time for the Q&A at the end. So that we'll get started. So I'd like to just start with beginning to look at the publishing landscape today, just so you have a sense of what's going on. So there are approximately 10,000 publishers today, and approximately 5,000 of those are indexed in Scopus. And those publishers are publishing over 33,000 active English language peer-reviewed journals, and there's another 9,000 plus non-English language peer-reviewed journals out there. And this number traditionally grows year on year by about 3.5%. Now, these journals are publishing over 3 million articles a year, which is just mind-boggling to me. And this number tends to grow by about 3% year on year. However, the growth rates are accelerating in recent years. So we see about a 5% growth of new journals year on year, and about a 4% growth of published articles. And this is in part due to an increase in the research and development spend on behalf by governments globally. And this, investment by governments into research is supporting around 7 to 8 million researchers, depending on how you define researchers. And actually that number has grown since this research was done a couple years ago. So a lot of people are saying there's around 9 million researchers out there. Now, what's interesting to me is of those researchers, only about 20% publish more than one time. So the majority of people publish something probably from their dissertation as a requirement, and then they never publish again. Irrespective, you can see this is a really active landscape, and it's important for you to think through your research and your publishing strategies if you would like to make an impact in this landscape. So here we have a snapshot of the publishing process, and we're going to discuss each of these different stages today. Some we'll take a deep dive into, some we'll just touch on. But what I'd like to point out with this slide here is the different versions of the article that are listed on the slide. And it's really important to understand the significance of each of these versions, especially if you're not publishing in an open access journal. So the first version is AO, or Author's Original Manuscript. And increasingly, most people refer to this as the preprint. And this is a version that you submit for peer review. So this is your Word document or your LaTeX document that you submit to the journal. And this version you can post anywhere you would like. It's your original work. There have been no changes made to it. The second version is the accepted manuscript, and that's sometimes called a postprint. And this version has gone through the peer review process and been improved by that process, and then it's been accepted by the journal. But it hasn't been sent onward to the production department, so it hasn't been typeset. You haven't, received proofs or anything like that. And this version, authors are able to post on their personal website, or they can share via Facebook. They can share it via LinkedIn. If the article is published in a subscription-based journal, however, the author must wait until after an embargo period to archive that version of the article in an institutional repository. So for arts and humanities journals, embargo periods tend to be around 18 months. For science, technology, and medical journals, they tend to be around 12 months. So it's just really important to keep that in mind. Now, if the article that you've published is an open access article, you can submit it to a repository immediately. And then the last version on this slide is the version of record. And this is that final PDF. And it's maintained by the publisher, and it's updated with relevant information. So if there's, any corrections made to the this version, that will be posted on the website. And this version may not be posted online unless you have published an open access journal. So if you published in a subscription-based journal, the only version of the version of record should be on the publisher's website. Before you begin investigating possible journal options, it's essential you spend some time understanding your current project and the audience you'd like to reach. So throughout your career, you are likely to be involved in many different types of research, and you'll be producing a variety of content. And typically people focus solely on the research article, but you may publish review articles, whether that's a literature review or a theory review or a systemic review. You might publish position pieces or case studies. You might publish a book review, which I have to say is a really great way of getting started in publishing. Sometimes your work will be written for specialists in your field, but you may also choose to engage in public scholarship, writing for the general public, or maybe working with policymakers to write white papers. So take the time to determine your objectives. And when you begin investigating the appropriate place to publish, remember you're joining an ongoing conversation in your field. So make sure you're contributing thoughtfully to that conversation. Your contribution should be novel, and it should be pushing the discussion forward in some way. There are many different elements to take into consideration when choosing a journal, and I've listed a few here. So I'll just quickly go through these. Age, a well-established journal with a good reputation is a safe bet. However, that doesn't mean you should ignore new or recently established journals. They may be publishing cutting-edge research, or they may be using an interesting publishing model. Just make sure that you do the research on the journal before you submit. It can be helpful to look at the history of a journal. Has it published some of the key researchers in the field? Does it publish on time? Have there been problems with the journal, retractions or whatnot? Affiliation might be important. Is it a journal of an important society or an institution? Is it published by a trusted publishing house? And obviously scope is relevant, whether it's interdisciplinary, if it's a niche journal, if it's covering broad subject matter, a generalist journal. Is it a mega journal? All of this will be outlined in the aims and scope statement on the journal website. And I've talked a little bit about audience in terms of who you hope to attract. And you should be able to get a sense of who reads the journal by looking at the journal website. Is it practitioners? Is it a global audience? Just by looking at the website, sometimes they detail that, but you can get a sense of who's reading it by who submits to it, who's being published in it. Impact can be measured in a number of ways. So obviously a lot of people talk about the impact factor, but but you know, it can be just importance to the academic community in general. It can be a good source of teaching. The main thing is that you need to make sure you understand what is valued in your institution and field in terms of impact, because it can have an impact on your progression in your career. And the editorial board will give an indication of what type of research the journal's interested in receiving. Boards are built to reflect the ambitions of the journal. So say you've got a journal that is publishing in a certain area and there's an emergent area in that broader field, kind of a niche area, and they want to start publishing work in that area. They're likely to try and find someone who is a specialist in that area and bring them onto their editorial board so that they can act as an ambassador to that community, hoping to draw in submissions there, but also to help with the peer review process of those submissions. The same can be said about geography. If a journal is interested in receiving more research from, say, you know, Egypt, they might find an Egyptian editor that's a specialist in that field that can act, again, as an ambassador for the journal in that community. And publishing model is becoming increasingly important, and I'm going to discuss OA in a moment, so I'll just leave that there. For peer review style, there are a lot of different styles I'll talk about a little bit later, and you know, it might be important to you what style the journal uses. What I can say is all of this information will again be included in the instructions for authors, and sometimes it'll be listed under the aims and scope statement as well. And many journals post a rejection rate, not all of them. This obviously gives you an indication of the competition level of a journal. But even if they don't post that rejection rate, looking at some of these other qualities will give you a sense of how competitive that journal is, as well as looking at how many articles have been published online that haven't been assigned to an issue. So there's a lot of articles that you'll see, recent published articles, and they're not sitting in an issue. And that will kind of show you how popular a journal is. If they've got a lot of articles there, then that means that journal gets a lot of submissions. So some or all of these characteristics may be important to you when choosing a journal. It's just, again, depends on the project you're working on and what your ambitions are. Still, it can be challenging to choose a journal even after taking all of these characteristics into consideration. However, there are tools to help. So at Taylor & Francis, we have what we call a journal suggester, which will match your abstract with potential journals based on their aims and scope statements. And this will provide you with a list of journals to investigate further. So our advice is to select a few journals that are a good fit for your current project, for the work, for your work, and then create a list and rank them from your #1 choice onward. And when it's time to submit, start at the top of your list. Go for your #1 journal. And if your #1 choice isn't interested in your manuscript, just move down to #2 and try that one, and so on and so forth until your article is accepted. So I mentioned previously open access, and many, if not most of you, will be aware of open access and open research more broadly. But what are the benefits of publishing in an open access journal or an open access platform? The main benefits are greater visibility, and with that, potentially greater impact, both within the research community and the broader public. And the access, visibility, and impact can spur innovation and collaboration. So at Taylor & Francis, we've seen that open access articles typically receive substantially more citations. So it's about a 32% increase on non-OA. And greater readership with over 6 times as many downloads. Increasingly, in many countries, regions, and institutions, open access has become a requirement, or at least strongly encouraged. But let's just take a step back to look at what open access actually entails for those of you that might not be familiar with it. So there are 2 basic elements to open access. The first is making content freely available in a digital format, irrespective of where you sit in the world. And the second one is making content reusable by a third party. And I'll briefly discuss both of these. There are many terms terms thrown around when talking about open access. So you're likely to hear gold open access, you'll hear about green open access, you might hear about bronze open access or diamond open access. To be honest, it seems like there's a new term that emerges every day. Today, I'm just going to focus on gold open access. And gold open access essentially entails making the PDF or that version of record freely available online. It's as simple as that. And there are two ways in which an author can publish open access with Taylor and Francis, and this applies to most publishers, either in a fully open access journal or in what we call a hybrid journal. So for fully open access journals, all of their content is published in an open access manner. The journals are not funded by subscriptions. Instead, most charge an APC. However, many journals are funded by societies or institutional agreements. And in this case, either the author doesn't have to pay or they may pay a reduced fee, just depending on how much the society supports that journal. All of this information should be clearly presented on the journal website under the instructions for authors. And keep in mind, often your funder or institution will cover that charge. Now, hybrid open access is when an author chooses to publish open access in a journal that's subscription funded, but much of their content is not freely accessible unless your institution has a subscription. So these journals also charge an APC to cover the costs of those open access articles. However, many institutions and consortia have agreements with publishers to cover APC costs for hybrid journals. So basically, it's just about doing a little bit of research before you submit to an open access journal to see what your options are, see what kind of programs that journal in particular might have, but also to see what kind of arrangements your institution might have that are designed to help you publish open access. And of course, your funder. Now, the second element of open access is how your work can be used after publication by others. So if you publish open access, you'll be asked to choose a Creative Commons license, which describes how people can use your work in the future. Some journals don't give you a choice on which type of license you can use, so it's really important that you investigate prior to submission if you have any concerns. And here are the license. So we have CC BY, and this license allows authors to use your work in any way they choose, as long as they clearly attribute the authorship and the original publication, so they cannot claim that work for their own. And this is pretty much the default license for most open access journals. So most open access journals want you to use a CC BY. CC BY NC is the next one, and the NC stands for non-commercial. And here an author can use your work in any manner they'd like, but they can't profit from it. So for instance, they can't include your work in a compilation of different articles in a book that they will subsequently charge money for. And then the next one is CC BY ND. And here the author can't change your work in any way. They have to use it in its original format. For instance, this would mean that they couldn't translate your work into another language. And lastly, I've included CC BY SA. And this license means that when people use your work, they need to attach the same license that you did originally. And this is also important to be aware of when you're using other people's open access work in your article, just to be aware of how they used their work. With the rise of open access, we have seen an emergence of what are often called predatory publishers or journals. And I can imagine that some of you have been contacted by these publishers who show enthusiastic interest in your work and ask you to submit to the journal. Yeah, I even get these kind of emails sometimes. People think that I'm a researcher. You know, these emails, they often state the peer review process is unrealistically short, so they'll talk about days rather than weeks. Their websites might feature information that's incorrect or misleading. So the websites might look like a website of a well-known journal, but just some of the information will be slightly different, like the name will be just slightly different. And oftentimes they'll state things like they have a global impact factor. well, just be aware, impact factors are called just that, never anything else. And here are some of the other key characteristics of predatory journals. They have hidden or unclear author fees. And that's why I said earlier about the APCs, all of this information should be clearly stated on the journal website. You should never be surprised by a fee at the end of the process. And in fact, when you publish in an open access journal, usually when you're submitting, you are asked the question, whether or not you agree to pay the APC. You're asked to list what kind of funding you have, because then the publisher can calculate whether or not you need to pay an APC. So there are a lot of different parts of the process that are there to inform you of what your obligations are. So it shouldn't come as a surprise. The predatory journals tend to lack quality peer review of articles by experts in the field, and they guarantee acceptance and or the promise of very fast publication. So they'll talk about a week or 48 hours, which for anyone who's ever published before or been a peer reviewer before or works as an editor knows that that's just unrealistic. So if you want your research to be read and respected by others in your field, locally and or internationally, it's important to avoid publication in these fake journals. En masse, they erode the credibility of all the research published in them. However, there are some resources to help you make sound decisions about where you'd like to publish, and I've listed a few of them here. So for instance, one key resource is Think, Check, Submit. And this is a cross-industry initiative which aims to help researchers make informed choices and to choose trusted journals to publish their research in. So Think, Check, Submit can help you to identify high-quality journals which would be appropriate for submitting your research. And they do that by, they've created what they call a toolkit, which is basically a set of questions for you to go through and ask yourself, in terms of the journal. And this can help to protect you against fraud and publishing malpractice. However, I'd argue the best approach is to seek advice from experienced and respected colleagues. So those colleagues that have a lot of publishing experience, where you can say, hey, I've been contacted by this journal, does this look legitimate to you? Or if you've come across the journal, you can ask them about it. And also your librarian community, because they spend a lot of time looking at journals and in their work with publishers. Now, the next resource here is the DOAJ, Directory of Open Access Journals, and this is a database for open access journals, as it says. And the journals in this database have been screened to ensure that they are legitimate. However, like many databases, there is an assessment period. So new journals that are legitimate might not be listed immediately. And in those cases, you need to make sure that they're published by a respected publisher. And here's where this last organization, OASPA, can help. So OASPA is an organization for publishers and service providers working with open access. And members need to meet certain standards to be included. So again, they're assessed to see whether or not they meet those standards of membership. If the journal that you're considering publishing in isn't included in the DOAJ, and or their publishers are not members of OASPA, you should proceed with extreme caution. And again, I'm just talking about open access journals in this case. Right, so today we will not be doing a writing workshop, obviously, but I do have some simple guidance for you to consider while preparing your manuscript. And first of all, think like an editor. Make it easy for them to read and to enjoy your work. Depending on the size of a journal, an editor can receive anywhere from 50 to well over 1,000 manuscripts a year. So make sure yours stands out. And here's some basics just to help make your argument easy to read and to understand. Write first and edit later. This will help you create a through line in your paper. So that's the line that's going to throw, kind of tie all those different parts together. And remember, simplicity is key, especially when you're dealing with complex problems or theories. So think about your sentence structure and your use of passive voice. The goal is to make it as easy as possible for the reader to understand your arguments and understand your evidence, basically follow along the story you're telling. And the best way for achieving this is to create a clear and easy to follow structure to your paper. And irrespective of discipline, most academic papers follow this model here, what's called the IMRAD model. It's especially important that you create a strong introduction. So we're talking 2 to 3 pages. Editors and readers often assess the relevance of a paper based on the introduction. So it should be well structured and should articulate the key elements. And an introduction should basically establish the research question or problem that you're exploring, provide a clear thesis or argument, which is easy to see or understand, and make sure your argument stands out. You don't want to bury it in the midst of your 3rd paragraph. It should be something that's dominant, that's really easy to see and understand what you're arguing. And you want to also provide a map of your paper, so basically outlining the structure of your paper. And this lets readers know what they can expect. So, any kind of outline would obviously include something about your methods or your theory, your results, your discussion, and your conclusion. And, different disciplines might use different language for each of these sections, but this is the basic structure there. And lastly, your role is that of a storyteller. It's up to you to give life to the exciting story of your research. And it's, obviously it's something that you were excited about while you're doing the research. So be brave and be bold when you're telling that story. Once you publish, you of course would like people to be able to find and hopefully read your work, maybe even cite it. And this begins with the basics, the first elements of your article that potential readers will see, the title and the abstract. So title styles and format can vary somewhat depending either on subject area or even individual writing style. However, there are some tricks to keep in mind when composing your title. And the first one is write the title after you've written your paper. Though if you're like me and struggle with coming up with clever titles, it's not a bad idea to just kind of jot ideas down while you're writing, and then you can review them when you've actually finished the paper. Try and keep your titles fairly short and to the point. It may sound silly, but I did a bunch of research on titles and just looking at different advice that people give. And it seemed that most advise 16 words or fewer for whatever reason. But I think it's just because, it's a simple, direct, and easy to read amount of words. And make sure to include some essential terms from your paper in your title, some of those keywords. And it's important to remember to avoid jargon or abbreviations. You might have been doing research for so long that you don't realize that an abbreviation that you use all the time in your work, no one else has any idea what it means. So try and keep that stuff out of your title. And then when you do introduce it in your paper, of course, break it out, explain what you mean by the jargon, break out those abbreviations in the first time you use them so people know what you're talking about. And your title should capture the subject of your paper. Make sure that it stands out. And that could be for its clarity or for its creativity. Obviously, a play on words can be really effective for a title, but it should still give an indication of what the paper is about. An abstract. So why are abstracts important? Well, the abstract should tell the reader what the article is about. I like to think of them as little mini film trailers for your article. It should give a sense of what the story is about without providing all the details. So I always say it should be like a French film trailer that's a bit mysterious rather than an American film trailer where you never have to go to the movie because they've showed you everything. You actually want people to click through and read it. And here are some basic tips for creating a strong abstract. Again, like the title, it's difficult to write a decent abstract before you actually finish the paper, as the abstract is an overview or a map of the content. take some time reading the instructions for authors to make sure you know the parameters for the particular journal you're submitting to. Most have kind of word counts for their abstracts, and some of them have really particular guidance on format and structure. So definitely take a look there. And again, think about your potential audience and who you're trying to reach, and write the abstract for them. So if you're hoping that practitioners are going to read your article rather than people that are deeply embedded in that particular research field, you might use slightly different language. So just keep that in mind. And on the language front, do choose the language carefully. So again, think about keywords and how someone might search for your work. And if your work is interdisciplinary in nature, think about how other disciplines talk about your work, and make sure to kind of mix it up a bit so that you are definitely drawing in all the readers that you want. And after you've done that first write through of your abstract, I encourage you just to write down all your thoughts and then go through, remove any unnecessary words, mix, kind of shift things around so that you end up with a nice, tight abstract that doesn't have any superficial information in it. Excuse me. And if you end up revising your paper, which you will, after you've written the abstract, make sure to review and revise the abstract as well. So every revision, you should be looking at all the different pieces of your article, your title, your abstract, and the article to make sure they still all match. And lastly, read it out loud and have others read it for fluency. If your abstract is difficult to read and follow, it's unlikely that people are going to click through to your article, because they're going to assume the article is, difficult to read. And one last thing to remember here, editors often, when they're looking for peer reviewers for articles, they often send out the abstract. So it's really important that you do articulate what you're trying to achieve in your article in that abstract, so it gives a clear picture to potential reviewers as well. And along with the titles in the abstract, authors are often asked to provide keywords that will be included with the metadata for their article. So these act as little flags and searches to help readers find your work. You want to make sure to identify the words and phrases that would be effective in searching for your work. So you've already been doing that work with your title and your abstract, but this is another collection of words that you're going to be submitting. As I said with the abstracts, think about synonyms that people might use, so slightly different words when searching for that work. And when you're using words and phrases, be as specific as you can to narrow down the search results. So if you use a really general word, you're going to, end up by getting so many results. I use an example here where I've added qualifiers to homelessness. So if I type in homelessness in Google, I'm going to end up with all sorts of results for services and this sort of thing in the Stockholm area. Now, if I kind of bookend it with Swedish and policy, then I'm going to start getting information about NGOs and government agencies. I'll probably get some white papers. I might even get some academic papers there. So it's really about testing the words and seeing what kind of results you get. Plop your words in there. Is it what you expect? Great. If not, you might need to do some work on those. Okay, so before we discuss the process further, I'd like to take a moment to highlight some of the ethical issues we see on a regular basis. Issues around publishing ethics are seemingly on the rise, or I don't know, possibly we're just getting better at identifying breaches. And here are some of the issues that we see on a regular basis. And this, I should say, is just a partial list. So we have authorship issues, competing interests, duplicate submission or publication, data image or fabrication or falsification, plagiarism, text recycling, peer review manipulation, and breaches of copyright. And to be honest with you, we could easily have a full session on ethics today. So I'm just going to focus on 3 different issues that seem to be pretty common across disciplines. So that's authorship issues, duplicate submission and publication, and plagiarism or text recycling. So authorship disputes are quite common, and they tend to slow the peer review and production process down because if a dispute arises, we just stop the process at that point in time and ask the authors to resolve it. Often the issues have to do with disagreements over who is included on the authorship line, or maybe the sequence of names, who's responsible for different parts of the process, etc. You know, it's these types of things between co-authors. So to avoid any problems, it's extremely important that you have a written agreement between all the co-authors regarding responsibilities, the sequence of names on the authorship line, and what journals you're planning on submitting to. So apart from the standard authorship disputes, here are 3 distinct issues that we tend to see. And the first one is ghost authorship, and this is when a significant contribution to a manuscript has been made without acknowledgement of who has made that contribution. So there's an author that's missing from the authorship line. And this is an issue because we can't know if there is a conflict of interest. The second issue that we see is guest authorship, and this is when authorship is granted to an individual who doesn't meet the ethical standards of authorship, which I've listed on this slide. And they're usually included because of their seniority or their reputation or their supposed influence in the subject area. And this is common in some institutions, but anyone on the authorship line should have made a significant contribution to the paper, as they will be held responsible for it in the future. And the last one I've listed here is authorship for sale. And this one actually surprised me when I heard about it the first time, but there have been a number of cases where individuals, or mainly paper mills, offer to add an author's name after a paper has been accepted for publication, but for a price, and usually a pretty hefty price. And these actors obviously are preying on the desperation of scholars who are under so much pressure to publish more and more articles every year just to progress in their careers. So who qualifies as an author? I've listed a number of qualities here, and I just want you to note that I've put "and" in between each one of those. But the bottom line is any listed author is a representative of the published paper and should have in-depth knowledge about all aspects of the study as published. So that means that they should have, you know, good understanding of the rationale, the methodology, the analysis, and the interpretation. Right, so duplicate submission. This is a rule that many early career researchers are surprised by, at least I was. The main takeaway here is you may only submit your paper to one journal at a time. Why would it be a problem if you submitted to more than one journal? Well, when you submit your paper to a journal for peer review, you are committing to publish in that journal, and they will use their time and their resources to review your paper and help you improve it. And it's important to remember you can only publish a paper once. There can only be one version of record. Now, this is actually quite easy to detect. Often the papers are sent to the same reviewers, who then alert the editors and publishers. So you have an author that sent the paper to 2 different journals, and those 2 different journals have sent it to the same peer reviewer. And then that peer reviewer goes back to the 2 journals and says, hey, I'm reviewing the same paper for 2 different journals. And at that point, the publishers go back to the author and ask for some clarification, or the editor sometimes goes back too. So again, the process is stopped. We ask for clarification and see where we go from there. And again, this can often happen because there wasn't a clear agreement on the roles and responsibilities between the authors. Hence, 2 of the co-authors accidentally submit papers to 2 different journals. But I just have to say, editors are becoming less and less forgiving about this because it's become such a huge problem. So you need to do everything in your power to avoid this situation. Now, sometimes it is okay to submit work that's been presented elsewhere. You just need to be honest with the editors about previous presentations or publications or postings. The main thing to remember is transparency is key. For instance, if you publish an article in Polish, but you'd like to publish it in English or another language, you just need to contact the editor of the journal you would like to publish with and ask them if they'd be interested in publishing a translation. They may be happy to do so, or they may point you in the direction of another journal. It's also important to remember, if you do want to publish a translation, you need to let the original publisher know that you are planning on publishing a translation, just so that you have taken care of any permission obligations you might have. Similarly, with data presented at conferences, obviously it's not unusual to publish an article that's based on content presented at a conference. Again, you just want to make sure to clearly state that the data or an earlier version of the paper was presented at a conference. And lastly, preprint servers. Preprint servers no longer are an issue for most journals. Again, you want to cite that original posting in your paper and let the editor know that a version of the paper can be found in an archive or repository, and provide a link to that. And then what's really important is, after the paper's been published, you need to go back to that preprint server and put a link to the final version of your paper so that everything's linked up there. And lastly, we have originality issues. And these are becoming pretty easy to detect these days. Most journals use software to measure incidences of overlap with previously published work. And most of you know that if you use someone else's ideas or processes or words or data, you need to clearly cite them in the paper and provide full reference to the work. And this is also true of all content, so that goes for websites and blogs and such. What many are less aware of is the need to cite their own previously published work if you've used it in your paper. So if you're using the same ideas that you've previously published, as this will show up on an originality check. Now, on the flip side of that, we are seeing a rise of what's called text recycling, or you might have heard the term salami slicing. And this is when you use the same ideas or data or words excessively to the point that it's no longer offering anything new, no new insights or contributing anything new to the literature or to the field. Anything you publish should be original content and pushing the research field forward. Right, so once you are ready to submit, there are a few steps you should take. The first thing is, it's a good idea to review what has already been published in the journal that you're planning on submitting to, because you might find work that's relevant to your own. I've found that sometimes when I'm talking to editors, they'll say, we're so surprised when people submit, a paper on a topic that we published quite a few articles about, and they don't cite those previous articles. So do reference previously published articles from the journal where appropriate, but only if it directly relates to your paper and is helping you make your argument. Again, it comes back to the fact that you're joining a conversation that's ongoing in the journal. You also want to make sure that your work matches the aims and scope of the journal. And these statements describe the journal's mission, the type of research they're interested in publishing. Editors spend a good deal of time crafting these statements so that readers and librarians and authors understand exactly what the journal is about. One of the main reasons manuscripts are rejected is because the research didn't fall within the scope of the journal. So definitely take the time to read and understand these statements. And you'll find the aims and scope statements on the journal website. Sometimes it's on the landing page. And then for some journals, you'll see a link on. For Taylor and Francis, you'll find a little panel on the left-hand side. And you'll find a little link there where you can be directed to the aims and scope statement. The other thing that I wanted to say is make sure to read and follow the instructions for authors. I've mentioned it a few times. These are the rule books for the journal, and they will provide information and guidance on how to format your paper, on word counts, any information on relevant charges. So whether it's an open access journal, it's about APCs, or if there are page charges for a journal or submission fees, all that information will be clearly listed. So definitely take the time to read that. When you do submit to a journal, more often than not, you will be submitting to an online submission system, such as ScholarOne or Editorial Manager. So to the right here, you can see the landing page for one of our ScholarOne sites. And in this example, someone has begun the submission process. And once you've submitted, you'll be able to kind of follow your paper as it goes through the peer review process. So you'll be able to see what stage it's at. And I've also included a screenshot of our new submission portal, which most of our open access journals use, on the left-hand side of the screen. And this is a really intuitive, easy to use submission site linked to ScholarOne and Editorial Manager peer review systems. So as you can see here, the author will be asked to upload files, and in this case, either by dragging or uploading the file from the computer. And then once the file is uploaded, they're automatically transferred to the peer review system the journal uses, and the peer review process begins. So before you begin the submission process, take time to familiarize yourself with the system the journal uses. Make sure you understand, what kind of documents you need to have and if they need to be formatted in any particular way. And here are just some basic tips to keep in mind prior to submitting. First of all, as said, in most cases, you'll be submitting to an online system, so make sure you have everything on hand that you need to submit. If you're using images or data that's not yours, make sure that you have obtained permission. That's your responsibility, not the publisher's. And then to avoid any problems or mistakes, once again, make sure that you have an agreement with your co-editors on who's responsible for what, which journal you're submitting to, etc. Also, be certain that you have the correct information of all your co-authors. So that includes their preferred spelling of their name, email addresses, current affiliation, all that sort of thing. And lastly, I know this sounds silly, but make sure that you submit the final version and not an earlier draft. This happens. So people submit a draft and they think they're fine and dandy, and then 3 months later they get the rejection notification from the journal and they open it up and realize they submitted the wrong version of the paper. So take that extra 5 to 10 minutes just to make sure all the files you're submitting are the relevant files. So now we're going to just take a look at what peer review looks like in practice. And I mentioned earlier that there are different types of peer review, and these are the 3 types that you're likely to come across in your career. So the first is called single blind peer review, and this is when the peer reviewer knows the identity of the author, but the author doesn't know the identity of the peer reviewer. And this tends to be the most common type of peer review within the science, technology, and medical fields. The second type of peer review is double-blind peer review, and this is when all identities are hidden. And this tends to be the most common within arts and humanities and social sciences. And then lastly, there's open peer review, and this is where everyone's identity is known. And what I'd say about open peer review is that there are a lot of different there's a lot of variety within open peer review. So there's a lot of different types of open peer review. So if the journal does run an open peer review process, make sure that you understand what that process entails, just so that you know what to expect. And then here are the main roles involved in the peer review process. So no surprise, the editor is the main actor there. And editors will assess the article to see if it's a good fit for the journal in terms of content and quality. And then they are the ones that select reviewers, or sometimes they'll assign a manuscript to another board member. So especially in these larger journals, they'll have a lot of what they call subject editors. And so the editor will then select one of the subject editors that will then find the peer reviewers for that article. And then it's sent out to review. Once the editor receives the reports from the reviewers, they then make a final decision regarding publication. The peer reviewers, their job is to read and assess an article and any of the data that's included. And most journals have about 2 to 3 external reviewers assess a manuscript. And they will write a short report with suggested additions and changes for the author. And then they'll provide a recommendation to the editor regarding publication. And lastly, we have the journal staff. And they tend to be a part of the publishing house in most cases. And the journal staff is responsible for the systems that are used to run peer review. So they will often do an initial, what they call a technical check to make sure everything is in order. And then they also tend to manage communications between authors and editors and peer reviewers as it applies to the system. And if there are any technical issues with the peer review system, for instance, if you're trying to submit a manuscript and you're having a hard time uploading it, you're probably going to be in touch with the journal staff. They're going to be the ones that help you with those types of problems. So as you can see, there's many different people involved with the peer review process. And here's an overview of how peer review works in most cases. So your manuscript is submitted to the journal and it goes through that initial check to see if everything's in order. And so if it's not formatted correctly, if that's an issue for the journal, or if it's missing files or other components, it will be returned to you with instructions on what to do, whether that's reformatting or including more material. And then once the files are in order, the submission is sent to the editor for a quick review. So at this point, the editor will decide if the paper should be sent out to peer review. At this stage, it can be rejected if it's out of scope, if it's not complete, if it's unreadable, if it's not understandable. And this is called a desk reject. So that's why I say it's really important that you make your argument in those first 3 pages, that you really lay out what that paper is about. Make it easy for the editor to make the decision you would like at that point, which is to send it out to peer review. So if the paper is of interest, the editor will send it out for peer review. And again, this is usually to 2 or more external reviewers who are specialists in that particular area. And they will read the work and provide that report to the editor with a recommendation for decisions. And the most common decisions I've listed on this slide here. So you have revise and resubmit with major revisions, which to be honest can feel like a reject at times, but this means they're interested in your work. They see something in that work that is promising, but there's still quite a bit of work that you need to do. So they might like the data you're using, they might like the idea, but you still have a good chunk of work to do. Then there's revise and resubmit with minor revisions, and this means that they really like your paper, but there's just a few small changes that need to be made. These are really minor changes, as the word suggests. And then, of course, the paper can be rejected at this point. Now, I have included except with a star here. It is possible that your paper will be accepted without revisions, but it's highly unlikely. And I always tell the story of Eugene Fama, who I was privileged to see present when he won the Nobel Prize for Economics a few years ago. And I went to this lecture, and to be honest with you, I couldn't follow a lot of it. It was advanced mathematics, but Fama was presenting one of the papers that led him to win the Nobel Prize. And he stepped back at one point and says, hey, you know, I think this is one of the only papers that was ever accepted without revisions. So here's a man in his 70s presenting one of the papers that led him to win the Nobel Prize. And it was one of the only papers in his career that had been accepted without revisions. So that's just to say, expect work, expect revisions. Every piece of writing can be improved upon. Now, once you make your revisions, you will resubmit to the editor, who will either accept it at that point or send it back out to the reviewers to see if they're happy or if they have further comments. Now, here's the bad news. Your paper can go through this process a couple times and still be rejected. So I'll tell you how to avoid that. So you know, when you get your reports back from the journal, and especially if it's revise and resubmit with, you know, major rejections, as I said, sometimes it can feel like a rejection notice. And you can feel a little bit down in the dumps, you know, a little bit disheartened. And if you are feeling that way, I would just suggest shut down your computer for a couple days. Just forget about it. Walk away. You know, shake it out a little bit. And then when you're ready to work again, open up that computer and calmly read the decision letter that came from the editor. Because sometimes they'll give you advice on how to deal with the reviewer comments, especially if there is conflicting advice there. If one reviewer suggests one thing and the other reviewer suggests something different. The decision letter will also give you timelines. So when deadlines for returning your revisions and that sort of thing. Now, if you have co-authors on your paper, make sure to set up a meeting with them immediately and send them all the material. And once you get together, what I recommend is sitting down and looking at all those comments that the reviewers made and create a to-do list. Basically take every single comment and create a list. And you might even group them by category and then go through and decide what comments you think you would like to adopt and make those suggested amendments as appropriate. And here's the trick for avoiding that fate of going through the peer review process a couple times and still being rejected. You need to address every comment that the reviewers have made. So where you have amended, be very specific. That's why I suggest making a to-do list in a way, you know, so that when you submit your revisions back to the editor, you can say, you know, they asked for this is where we made the change, and this is the material that we included or removed, or whatever the case is. You can also do a lot of highlighting with your manuscript that you're sending back with the revisions, so that you're just making it easier for the editor to see where those changes were made. Now, as said, you might not agree with all of the suggestions that a peer reviewer makes, which is perfectly fine. You know your project better than anyone else. But if you decide not to amend or not to make a change that was recommended by a peer reviewer, you need to say why. You need to be very specific about why you didn't adopt that recommendation. And remember to be respectful. And as you're getting ready to send back your revised manuscript and your letter to the editor, outlining what changes you have made and where you haven't made those changes, make sure to read that letter a couple times just to make sure it's super clear that you haven't forgotten anything. And then also to make sure that there isn't any kind of frustration evident in the letter, because it can be a frustrating process, and that can be reflected in language sometimes. You want to make sure to be professional and respectful of the reviewers and the editors. This is your community. So, you know, it's likely in the future that you will resubmit to that journal. You'll probably submit throughout your lifetime to the journal. You might have ambitions to be on the editorial board. These might be your future collaborators. So treat them with the respect that they deserve, because remember, they're just trying to help you publish your very best work. I always think of peer review as a gift. It's a painful gift, but it really is people taking their time to help you be the very best writer you can be. People always ask for the top reasons for rejection, and these are some of the reasons that we've gathered from the editors that we work with. And the top reason here, sent to the wrong journal. So this really is about carefully reading those aims and scope statements and looking at what's been previously published in the journal, just to make sure your work fits. And for number 2, this comes down to understanding what sort of writing project you're undertaking and researching the best platform for your work. Again, you might not always, what you're working on might not always lead to a research article. You know, it might have been that it needed to be something that was, you know, geared towards the general public. Public scholarship is very important. So it's just taking the time to understand that. Number 3 is really easy. It's about reading and following the instructions for authors. They will always give you word counts for every type of content that they accept. And 4 through 9 really is about sharing your work as much as you can. You know, I always encourage people to workshop their papers, have trusted and critical colleagues read and comment. You know, try and find those people in your cohort that are, you know, they've got the red pen and they're going to rip your paper apart to help you improve it. You don't want to find the people that are super nice and say, wow, this is fantastic, because that doesn't really help really in the end, except, you know, maybe bolster your ego a little bit. I always also suggest, if you can, present your work as often as you can in conferences, whether they're regional conferences, whether they're international conferences. It's good to get outside of your own community and see how your work travels, see how other people accept your work. And one tip I have from when I was in grad school, I'm a geographer, but I did interdisciplinary work. So I did a lot of work in law and society studies. And we had what we called a brown bag lunch meeting once a month. And this group was interdisciplinary, so geographers, political scientists, you know, anthropologists, et cetera, all within the social sciences. And the other thing was, it was people at different stages of their career. So PhD students, but also tenured faculty that had published, you know, 20 articles. And what was really useful for these types of groups is, number one, you get a diverse array of feedback. You know, you're really seeing how well you're communicating, because it's people from outside of your subject area reading your work. But also I thought that it really demystified the process, because you see that even people that have published numerous times still struggle with the process. Writing's hard, communicating's hard. So if you have the opportunity to do that in your institution, I highly recommend it. It was really useful. Now, the last one here, number 10, libelous, unethical, rude, or lack subjectivity. I think it goes without saying, avoid at all costs. Right, so what to do when your article is accepted? Well, obviously celebrate, you've earned it. While getting published is a great accomplishment, no matter the stage of the career, it's especially true the first time. So as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, it's important that you think about those different versions of your manuscript. So you want to keep that original manuscript that you submitted and the accepted manuscript, because you may post those different versions in different places. You know, again, the accepted manuscript can be posted in an institutional repository after an embargo period, or directly on your website. Now, publishers try their very best to move manuscripts through the production process as quickly as possible, but a lot of it depends on the author. So make sure to return proofs by the suggested deadline. They tend to be quite tight, like 2 to 3 days, and answer any queries that the production editor has as quickly as possible. You know, help them do their job. And lastly, don't hesitate to ask questions. These processes can be a little bit confusing, even if you've published before, but with a different publisher. We unfortunately all use different systems. So if anything's confusing, just ask. That's what we're here for. We're happy to help. Right, and just highlighting a couple, you know, fairly simple and effective tools to help increase the visibility of your work. The first one is use your email signature. So, you know, underneath your address and such, I recommend you just putting recent publications and then having a link to your most recent article with a brief summary, just one-line summary about what the article's about, so people know whether or not to click through to it. It's likely that you're writing to people that are interested in the same kind of research you are. Likewise, if you can, put a link on your department or institutional website, again, with a couple lines, just a real brief summary so people know what the article is about. If you're on any networking sites, whether that's academic, professional, or social networking sites, use those as much as you can. And you don't have to make a big show of it. I have a friend that always, you know, what he'll do is he always on Facebook, whenever he has a new publication, he says, this might be of interest to some, and he puts a link. You know, simple as that, it takes 2 seconds, but do link to it as many times as you can, because the more your article is linked to from different sites, the higher up it's going to fall in search engines when people are searching for the particular subject area. And lastly, if you're a blogger or have a personal web page, obviously highlight it there. Before I finish today, I'd just like to highlight a couple of our resources that you can explore on your own. So the first one here is How Researchers Change the World. And we've got two resources under this. One is a podcast. And in the podcast, every episode has a researcher talking about their research, which usually is a cutting edge piece of research that shaped some of the ways in which we think today. So in the podcast, you'll hear the story behind the research directly from the researcher. So why this topic was so important to investigate and how they developed the research and how it's gone on to impact the world in which we live. And then alongside the podcast, we've developed two 12-week learning programs for researchers. So one's designed for early career researchers, covering a lot of different elements that we talked about today, but even more. And then another one that is developed for mid-career researchers that's focused more on increasing the impact of your work. So both of these are free and easy to sign up for. You get little reminders in your inbox. So I encourage you to go to that www.howresearchers.com site and sign up. And then lastly, we've got this great resource, Author Services website, and it offers support and guidance and tips on everything from copyright to ethics to choosing a journal, how to tweet your research, more on peer review, etc. There's tons of information there, so I encourage you to check that out. And that's it for me. I just wanted to highlight, there's my email address. If you have questions that you don't ask today, but you think about in a couple days, don't hesitate to get in touch. I'm happy to help. Yeah, that's it. I will put my camera back on.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So now the talk is open for questions. Because I make a list and I have like 10 or even more. But I probably will not ask all of them. But let's give a chance to other.
Oh, you have 10 of your own.
Yeah, I have 10 on my own. I made a list of questions. Yeah. So yeah, maybe I will start. Okay. So you said about the importance of the title, and I'm interested. What's your thinking about? What's your opinion about putting the same words in keywords and in the title? Should you use the same words, or should you use synonyms? Or if, for example, if in the title there is a zinc oxide, then in the keywords should be ZNO, for example.
Not a bad idea. Yeah, I mean, if you can use synonyms and it makes sense, I mean, don't just use synonyms to use synonyms. It should be something that you think, yeah, somebody might search for it like this. I mean, it's really coming back to how do you yourself search for research, when you're looking for interesting articles, and think about what words you yourself would put in. But yeah, synonyms if appropriate, but if there's not a logical synonym, then I wouldn't.
Yeah, so this was first question, but I think that the most important among the one that I marked here. So, what's in your opinion? Can you define what is a substantial contribution to actually include author to the author list? Where is the border between going to acknowledgements and to the author list?
Yeah, well, I think that anybody that's on the author list contributed to the paper, not just in a conversation, over coffee on, a certain aspect, but they should have contributed. So whether they're contributing data, whether they wrote a section, they should have been involved in the entire process in one way or the other. And if it's somebody who is just, given advice or maybe pointed you in the right direction, that would be acknowledgements.
Okay. Cool. We have a question from the participant. So Sunny D, please turn on your microphone and ask a question.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. It's not a question, it's rather a comment or a contribution, or saying thank you, Victoria, for all your comments. I'm not a scientist, I'm interpreter and translator who often deals with scientific papers.
Mhm.
And I would like to thank you for some of the comments, some of the tips you gave about simplicity being the key, about complicated ideas expressed plainly, about avoiding redundancies or cliches, clarity, about avoiding jargon and abbreviations. Because when I translate texts from Polish into English, I very often have to struggle with what I myself call spaghetti sentences, which extend over 10 or 11 lines, and I'm just looking for the final dot, for the message behind, because that's what children in Polish schools are taught, that you have to write long sentences with lots of difficult words. So if nobody understands it, it means that's fine. And my message to all scientists who are probably listening to me and who are writing in Polish and submitting their texts for translation is, please keep it simple.
Yes, I agree 100%. And I usually have one other line on that slide, and I'm curious if you would agree with me, because I found this when I moved to Sweden. People write in the passive voice a lot here, and they write really long sentences. And as you can all see, I'm an American. We're all, subject, subject, verb, object, it's like very simple. And the rule I used to have for my students was 2.5 lines. If it goes over 2.5 lines, you've lost me. I'm going, wait, what was the subject?
Absolutely, but the problem is that in Polish we write in a completely different way, and being simple or repeating words is something that we do not treat as a good style, or as so. If you write in English, or if you write for an English paper, keep it simple and avoid cliches or redundancies. That's the key message. Thank you very much for that.
Yes,
it was excellent, excellent speech. Thanks a lot.
Great, thanks.
Cool. Thank you very much. So is there any more question, comments, things that needs clarification? Actually, still, there is. So Ms. Szymańska, you can ask a question.
Okay, hello. Thank you for great presentation. I am a little bit stressed because of so good English my former speakers, but I try to be clear. I have a question about previous publication, because maybe I give you an exact example which I met recently. We try to use Luxembourg income search. It is a quite huge database, and they give us access to this database for free even. But when we use this data, when we write a paper, we have obligation to publish it in their working papers. This is without peer review, without anything, but these working papers are on their website. And some kind of obstacle to publish then in some journals or not? Should we be afraid of this kind of requirements, or it is not a problem?
I think it depends on the journal, but what you're just describing to me is not that much different than a preprint server. It's an article that hasn't gone through peer review. It doesn't have a DOI. It hasn't been published. It's been posted. So, but again, my advice to you would be to write to the journals you're interested in submitting to and saying, here's the situation. It hasn't been peer reviewed. It hasn't been published in the sense that it doesn't have a DOI. It's just a working paper on a website, and then see what they say. Likely they'll say, okay, we'll take a look at it, or they might say, you know what, actually we're not interested in it, but this journal over here might be. Does that make sense?
Makes sense, but the problem is that we first have to decide use this database and put much effort and prepare this paper, and then maybe we decide in which journal to publish, and then somebody answer us not, this is not possibility, and maybe if this is a huge obstacle, we can resign with use this database, and we will be looking for different source of data. But we don't know if it's how many journals can refuse to publish our article in this situation. How common it is, this practice, I don't know. It's very difficult to assess which doors we close this way. How many doors we close this way.
Right. As I said, I think it's changing now because people are developing a greater openness to preprint servers. And so I think that opens the door to many working papers as well. But what you might do, if you're concerned about this, if you feel nervous about this, is maybe write to one or two editors of the journals that you are interested in publishing in ultimately. And just say, this is the project that we want to do. This would be our requirements. Would that be a hindrance to publishing in your journal?
Yes, but generally you think that it will be not a huge problem, probably, yes?
What I'm saying is I think the landscape's changing, but your best bet is to talk to an editor. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Not a problem.
Thank you.
Okay, now we have Grzegorz.
Hello, Victoria. Thank you for a great presentation. I mean, you touched so many key elements of the presentation in 1 hour. Wow, really great. So I'm really interested in one of the last slides with this podcast series.
Oh, yeah.
I made a quick Google and I found something which is like 15 minutes to develop your research career. It could be a different podcast. So the one.
I'll share the slide with you.
Okay.
I'll be sharing all these slides with you, so you can go directly to the link there.
Right. So this is a closed course, yeah, with 12 episodes, or this is something which is continuous and every week there's something new.
Yeah, basically, I think the podcast. I haven't signed up for the podcast. I've listened to a couple of them, but I did sign up for the course because I just wanted to see what it looked like, and that I get. I think I get a chapter a week for the course. And then the podcast, I believe you can just go in and dip into it and listen to different ones. But I hate to say I'm not 100% sure on that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, thanks for that. And, as a big fan of podcast, I would definitely, follow that. And I think it's a really good idea of making podcasts for researchers.
Yeah, I think we're all so tired in the eyes. I've become a huge fan of podcasts these days because I can't look at another screen after I'm done with work.
So true.
Yeah.
Okay, I have one question that may be a little bit off topic and maybe a little bit bold. So I would like to ask about your direct competition, MDPI publisher. So in Poland, they actually gained a lot of acknowledgement, and a lot of people are using them. So, for example, recently I've checked a person who published, within the last 3 years, he published 30 papers and 29 of them were in MDPI journals. And on the other hand, I have, not only a feeling, but I have signals from, for example, Oxford or from Switzerland that MDPI sometimes is regarded as a semi-predatory due to their business model. So what do you think, whether it's a good idea for the young scientists to actually go with the MDPI or wait how the situation will come away with this, and if there will be some agreement whether this is like a good publisher or not?
Right. I hate to see it. I'm not that up to speed with the current kind of conversation around them, so I can't really comment too much about that. But again, what I would say is for young researchers, if you are thinking about a journal, irrespective of the publisher, but you're a little bit hesitant about it, I would go to my committee. You know, I would go to the people that I work with, that I respect, that have a lot of experience in publishing, and say, what do you think of this journal? And then have it, because your community is the one that probably has the best sense of what journals you should be publishing in. So that would be my recommendation. I can't talk more broadly about them just because I just don't know that much about them.
I understand.
Actually. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for maybe the last question or comment. Okay.
It's Friday afternoon, people are getting sleepy.
Friday, yeah. So if this is not the case, thank you very much, Victoria, one more time. It was really, really cool. I believe that all people enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you very much. It was great to meet you.
Thank you, Anita.
Bye.
Bye.